The fluorescent lights in the nursing home flicker sometimes, especially late at night. The staff say it's just old wiring, but I know better. I've seen enough flickering lights in my lifetime to know when something's not right. My name is Augustus Gus Blackwood, and at 89 years old, I've finally decided to break my silence about what happened to my squad during the Korean War. The nurses here at Mountain View Retirement Home in Montana think I'm just another elderly veteran with deteriorating memories, living out my final days in quiet solitude. They smile politely when I wake up screaming, chalking it up to PTSD from the war. If only they knew the truth. If only they knew what really happened during those frigid days of December 1950. I was a staff sergeant then, leading a reconnaissance squad in the 7th Infantry Division. Young, ambitious, and completely unprepared for what we would encounter. The military trained us for combat against the Chinese and North Korean forces, but nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared us for what we found in that godforsaken village. Before I continue, I need you to understand something. I'm not writing this because I want to. I'm writing this because I have to. The doctors gave me 3 months to live last week. Pancreatic cancer. By the time anyone reads this, I'll probably be gone. And maybe that's for the best, because the thing that haunted us, that took my men, it's still out there. I can feel it, even now, waiting in the shadows of my room. Let me tell you about my squad. They weren't just soldiers, they were my brothers. First, there was Thaddeus Blackburn. We called him Doc. He wasn't your typical combat medic. Before the war, he'd been studying to become a priest at a seminary in Philadelphia, the kind of man who could stitch up a wound while quoting both the Bible and medical textbooks. He had this calm about him, even under heavy fire. His hands never shook, not even when the shells were falling all around us. Declan Knuckles Fitzgerald was our bar gunner, a tough kid from South Boston with shoulders like a bull and fists that had won him the local boxing championship 3 years running. He'd grown up on the streets, fighting for everything he had, but he had a heart of gold. Every penny of his pay went back home to his mother and sisters. Percy Hawthorne handled our radio communications, college dropout from Georgia who knew more about electronics than the entire Signal Corps combined. He could fix a radio with paper clips and chewing gum if he had to, quiet type, always scribbling in his notebook when we weren't on patrol. Said he was writing a novel about the war, but none of us ever got to read it. Zephyr Wolf Creek was our scout. Full-blooded Cherokee from Oklahoma who could track a ghost through a blizzard. At least, that's what we thought before we discovered there were real ghosts to track. He'd learned his skills from his grandfather, who'd been a scout in World War I. Zephyr never talked much about his past, but his skills kept us alive more times than I can count. The youngest of our group was Axel Thorne, just 18 and fresh out of basic training. He'd lied about his age to enlist early, something we didn't discover until weeks into our deployment. A farm boy from Nebraska who'd never seen a mountain before Korea, let alone fought in one. His youth and innocence made what happened even harder to bear. The Chosen Reservoir campaign was already a frozen hell before our mission began. Temperatures dropped to 30 below zero, cold enough to freeze the fuel in our vehicles and the blood in our veins. The Chinese had surrounded the 1st Marine Division and elements of the 7th Infantry Division. It was our job to gather intelligence on enemy movements, to find a way to break through their lines. I remember the morning we received our orders. The sun hadn't yet risen over the jagged Korean mountains, and steam rose from our coffee cups like spirits trying to escape the cold. Colonel Ambrose Blackhawk called me into his tent, the canvas walls shuddering against the bitter wind. The map spread across his field desk showed the treacherous terrain we'd be facing. "Blackwood," he said, his breath visible in the frigid air. "We need eyes on suspected Chinese movements in these valleys." His gloved finger traced a route through the mountainous terrain. "Take your squad and scout the area. Radio back anything you find, but do not, I repeat, do not engage unless absolutely necessary." I knew the risks. At those temperatures, with that terrain, even a simple reconnaissance mission could turn deadly. But orders were orders, and my squad was the best at what we did. If anyone could complete this mission and make it back alive, it was us. If I had known then what I know now, I would have shot myself in the foot before leading my men into those mountains. Because what we found there wasn't Chinese troops or North Korean soldiers. What we found was something that had been waiting for thousands of years, something that had fed on the violence and death of countless wars, something that had developed a taste for soldiers' souls. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you exactly how it all began, how 6 brave men walked into those mountains, and why only 2 walked out, though sometimes I wonder if even we truly escaped. We set out at first light, each man carrying enough ammunition and supplies for 3 days. The morning sky was the color of a bruise, purple and yellow, as if the heavens themselves were wounded. The temperature had dropped even further overnight, and the snow crunched beneath our boots like broken glass. Declan took point with his bar, the weapon looking almost small against his massive frame. Zephyr moved like a shadow alongside him, reading the terrain with those keen eyes of his. The rest of us followed in a staggered formation, with Percy bringing up the rear, the radio pack humming softly on his back. The first few hours were uneventful, just the endless white landscape, the wind howling through the peaks like a wounded animal, and the rhythmic sound of our breathing. Doc Blackburn kept checking on everyone, making sure no one was showing signs of frostbite. He'd already treated 2 cases back at base camp, and he wasn't about to let any of us lose fingers or toes on his watch. It was around noon when Zephyr held up his fist, the signal to halt. We all froze in place, weapons ready, scanning for any sign of the enemy, but what he'd spotted wasn't Chinese troops or North Korean soldiers. Through the swirling snow, nestled in a valley between 2 towering peaks, was a village. "Something's wrong," Zephyr said, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's no smoke." He was right. In weather this cold, any inhabited village would have smoke rising from every chimney, but this place, nothing, just the wind and the snow and the silence. We approached cautiously, using the terrain for cover. Axel, young as he was, noticed it first. "Sarge," he called out softly, "look at the snow. There's no tracks, not even animal tracks." The village itself was like something from a painting. Traditional Korean houses with their curved tile roofs, a small Buddhist temple on the eastern edge, and a central courtyard with what looked like a frozen well. Everything was perfectly preserved under a blanket of snow. Too perfectly preserved. "Check the buildings," I ordered. "Teams of 2. Doc, you're with me. Declan, take Axel. Percy, you and Zephyr circle around back. Keep your eyes open and your weapons ready." The first house we entered stopped us cold. A table was set for breakfast, steam still rising from bowls of rice and soup. Chopsticks laid neatly beside each setting. A tea kettle whistled softly on the cooking fire, which somehow still burned despite there being no one to tend it. "This is impossible," Doc muttered, touching one of the bowls. "This food is hot, like it was just served." I reached for my watch, an old bulova my father had given me before I shipped out. The second hand had stopped moving. When I checked with the others, we found all our watches had stopped at exactly 3:47. That's when we heard it, a sound that didn't belong in that frozen valley, a child's laughter echoing through the empty streets. But when Declan and Axel rushed outside to look, there was nothing there, just undisturbed snow and the wind. Percy's voice crackled over the radio, tight with tension. "Sarge, you need to see this. Eastern edge of the village, by the temple." We regrouped at the temple entrance. What Percy and Zephyr had found made my blood run colder than the winter air. Carved into every tree surrounding the temple were symbols. Not Korean or Chinese characters, but something older, something that seemed to shift and change when you looked at them directly. "I don't like this," Declan said, his fingers tightening on his bar. "We should call this in." Percy was already reaching for the radio pack. He clicked the transmitter several times, but all we got was static, not the normal kind of interference. This static had a pattern to it, almost like words being spoken just below the threshold of hearing. That's when Axel saw the writing on the temple wall, fresh marks in the ancient wood, the characters still sharp and clean as if they'd been carved moments ago. Doc Blackburn stepped forward, squinting at the text. It's a mixture of ancient Korean and something else, he said. I can only make out parts of it, but what I can read. His voice trailed off. What does it say, Doc? I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. He turned to face us, his expression grave. It says, "The hungry ones welcome you to the feast." Night was falling fast, and with it came a bone-chilling cold that made our earlier discomfort seem pleasant by comparison. We had two choices: try to make our way back through the mountains in the dark, or spend the night in the village. Neither option felt right, but the dropping temperature made the decision for us. "We'll shelter in the temple," I ordered, though every instinct screamed against it. "It's defensible, and the walls will block the wind." The temple's interior was a single large room with smaller chambers branching off to the sides. Ancient murals covered the walls, depicting scenes that made us all uneasy. At first glance, they appeared to be traditional Buddhist artwork, but the longer you looked, the more wrong they seemed. Warriors locked in combat with creatures that couldn't exist, battlefields strewn with bodies that weren't quite human, dark figures feasting on what looked like souls rising from fallen soldiers. "These aren't normal temple paintings," Doc Blackburn said, studying them intently. "They're a warning." Percy set up the radio equipment while Declan and Axel cleared space for us to bed down. Zephyr moved silently through the temple, checking every corner, every shadow. I noticed his hands were trembling slightly, something I'd never seen before. "Found something," Percy called out. He was holding a stack of scrolls discovered in a lacquered box behind the altar. "Doc, can you read any of this?" Doc Blackburn carefully unrolled the first scroll. The paper was yellow with age but perfectly preserved. His lips moved silently as he translated the ancient text. "It's a record," he said finally, "dating back to the Joseon dynasty. It talks about hungry ghosts, but not the traditional Buddhist hungry ghosts. These are different. They're described as the ones who feast on valor, who drink courage like wine, who feed on the essence of warriors." "Ghost stories," Declan scoffed, but his voice lacked conviction. "Every old temple's got 'em." A sudden gust of wind extinguished half our lanterns, leaving us in flickering shadows. The temperature inside the temple plummeted until we could see our breath. That's when we heard it. A sound like thousands of whispers all speaking at once, coming from everywhere and nowhere. "Set up a watch rotation," I ordered, fighting to keep my voice steady. 2 men at a time, 2-hour shifts. No one goes anywhere alone. Zephyr and Percy took first watch. The rest of us tried to sleep, but the whispers never really stopped. They just faded in and out, like a radio picking up fragments of countless conversations. Sometimes they almost formed words in English, Korean, Chinese languages none of us knew but somehow almost understood. I was half dozing when Axel shook me awake. "Sarge," he whispered, "something's wrong with the radio." Percy was hunched over his equipment, headphones pressed to his ears. The radio was emitting a sound I'd never heard before, not static, but a rhythmic pulsing that made my teeth ache. Percy's face was ash white. "There are voices," he said, "hundreds of them. They're speaking in some kind of ancient Korean dialect, but they're talking about us. They know our names." Before I could respond, Zephyr's voice cut through the darkness. "Someone's out there." We gathered at the temple entrance. Through the swirling snow, we could see figures moving in the village. They looked like soldiers, some in modern uniforms, others in ancient armor, but they weren't casting any shadows in the moonlight. "Those aren't our people," Declan said, raising his bar, "and they sure as hell aren't Chinese." "Hold your fire," I ordered. "No one shoots unless I give the word." The figures moved closer, their forms seeming to shift and change. One moment they were clearly visible, the next they were like smoke in the wind, and they were heading straight for the temple. That's when the screaming started. The sound came from one of the side chambers, a high, terrible shriek that couldn't have come from a human throat. Doc Blackburn swung his lantern toward the sound, illuminating the empty room. Empty except for Zephyr's rifle, lying abandoned on the floor. Our scout, the man who could track anything through any terrain, had vanished without a trace. The only evidence he'd ever been there was a set of boot prints in the dust that led to the center of the room, and simply stopped. "Spread out," I ordered. "Find him." We searched every inch of the temple, then the surrounding area. Nothing. No tracks in the snow, no sign of struggle, no blood, nothing. Zephyr Wolf Creek, one of the finest soldiers I'd ever known, had disappeared into thin air. The radio crackled to life on its own, Percy's equipment spitting out bursts of static and fragments of voices. Through the noise, we heard something that froze us all in place. Zephyr's voice, distant and distorted. "They're in the walls. They're in the walls. God help me, they're everywhere." Then silence, broken only by the wind and that endless, maddening whisper. None of us slept after Zephyr disappeared. We huddled in the main chamber of the temple, backs to each other, weapons pointed at every shadow. The figures outside kept moving through the snow, always just at the edge of visibility. Sometimes they looked like Chinese soldiers, sometimes Korean warriors from centuries past. Once, I swore I saw a Roman legionnaire, his armor caked with frost, his empty helmet turned toward our sanctuary. Dawn came, but the sun brought no warmth and little light through the heavy clouds. Doc Blackburn hadn't stopped reading the scrolls, his lips moving silently as he translated page after ancient page. "I know what this place is," he said finally, his voice hoarse. "It's called the Valley of the Fallen Armies. According to these records, armies have been disappearing here for thousands of years. Roman legions that somehow got lost and ended up in Korea. Mongol horsemen, Korean warriors, Chinese soldiers. They all vanished without a trace." "That's impossible," Percy said, still trying to get the radio working. "Romans never made it to Korea." "Unless they weren't lost by accident," Doc continued. "These scrolls, they suggest something was calling them here, drawing them in, like moths to a flame." Axel, who'd been unusually quiet since Zephyr vanished, suddenly spoke up. "The floor. Look at the floor." We all looked down. The temple's stone floor had changed. The flagstones seemed to pulse with a faint, sickly light, and what we thought were decorative patterns were actually characters. Thousands of them, spiraling out from the center of the room. "Their names," Doc whispered, kneeling to look closer. "Names and dates, so many names." Declan moved to the center of the spiral, his boots scraping against the stone. "There's something underneath, like a trapdoor or..." The floor gave way beneath him. We scrambled to the edge of the hole, shining our lights down. Declan had fallen about 10 feet onto a pile of rubble. He was already getting up, cursing colorfully in his thick Boston accent. "I'm fine," he called up, "but you need to see this. There's some kind of tunnel down here." One by one, we lowered ourselves into the hole. The tunnel was ancient, its walls lined with more of those shifting, changing symbols. Our flashlight beams revealed a passage stretching into darkness. "Look at the walls," Percy said, running his hand along the stone. "These aren't cut, they're melted, like something burned its way through the rock." The tunnel sloped downward, leading us deeper beneath the village. The air grew thicker, heavier, filled with a metallic taste that reminded me of blood. After about 100 yards, the tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber. "Dear God in heaven," Doc breathed. Our lights revealed a massive cavern filled with bodies. Thousands of them, maybe tens of thousands, perfectly preserved in the cold. Warriors from every age, every nation, every war that had ever touched this cursed land. Roman soldiers lay beside Korean warriors, Chinese peasant soldiers beside American GIs from World War II. Some looked like they were sleeping, others wore expressions of absolute terror. "They're not decomposed," Axel said, his voice shaking. "Some of these bodies are thousands of years old, but they look fresh." He was right. Even the oldest corpses showed no signs of decay. Their skin was pale but intact, their uniforms and armor still bright with color, and they all faced the same direction, toward a raised platform at the far end of the chamber. Percy's radio crackled to life, making us all jump. Through the static, we heard voices, hundreds of them, thousands, all speaking at once in different languages. Among them, we heard Zephyr's voice. Don't look at it. Don't let it see you." That's when we noticed the shadows on the chamber walls weren't matching our movements. They were moving independently, flowing like black water toward the platform. And there was something on that platform, something huge and dark and impossible to look at directly. It seemed to shift and change, like smoke trying to hold a shape, but there was nothing natural about its movement. Axel screamed. One of the bodies, a Chinese soldier who couldn't have been dead more than a few months, had grabbed his ankle. All around us, the corpses were beginning to move, their eyes opening to reveal nothing but darkness behind them. "Run," I ordered, but it was too late. The thing on the platform unfolded itself, rising up and up until it nearly touched the chamber's ceiling. In the beam of our flashlights, I caught glimpses of what it truly was, a writhing mass of shadows and half-formed figures, thousands of faces pushing through its surface like drowning men trying to break through ice, and every single face was screaming. The temperature plummeted. Our flashlight beams seemed to bend around the entity, creating impossible shadows that moved and danced on the walls. The voices from Percy's radio reached a deafening crescendo, and through the cacophony, I heard something that chilled me more than the supernatural cold. It was laughing. "Fall back," I screamed over the cacophony of voices. We scrambled toward the tunnel entrance, but the moving corpses were everywhere, reaching for us with cold hands. Declan's bar roared in the confined space, the muzzle flash illuminating the horror around us in stuttering bursts of light. "Don't shoot them," Doc Blackburn yelled. "They're not real. They're manifestations." But they felt real enough. Their hands were ice cold as they grabbed at our clothes, our weapons, our flesh. Percy was yanked off his feet by a Roman centurion, only to be pulled free by Axel's quick thinking with a bayonet. The kid's face was pure white, but he hadn't frozen up. Not yet. We made it back to the tunnel, climbing over each other in our desperation to escape. The thing on the platform, that massive shifting amalgamation of shadows and faces, was moving toward us, filling the chamber with its presence. The walls themselves seemed to warp and bend around it. Back in the temple, we slammed the stone trap door shut and pushed every heavy object we could find on top of it. The whispers continued, seeping through the stone like water through a sieve, but at least we couldn't see that thing anymore. That's when I noticed Declan hadn't said a word since we escaped. He stood perfectly still in the corner, his bar hanging loosely from one hand, his head cocked at an unnatural angle. "Knuckles," I approached him cautiously. "You all right?" He turned, and I stumbled backward. His eyes were completely black, like pools of ink, and when he smiled, his teeth had gone sharp and wrong. "Your friend is here with us now," Declan said, but it wasn't his voice. The words came out in layers, dozens of voices speaking in perfect unison, some in languages I'd never heard before. "They're all here with us, all the brave ones, all the warriors, all the soldiers who ever died with violence in their hearts." Doc Blackburn stepped forward, pulling a crucifix from beneath his uniform. "In the name of God." Declan's laugh cut him off, a horrible sound like breaking glass and screaming metal. "Your God has no power here, priest, who would be doctor. This place is older than your faith, older than all faiths. We were here when the first human picked up a rock and used it to crush his brother's skull." The temperature in the temple dropped again. Frost began forming on the walls, creating patterns that looked disturbingly like faces. Percy's radio erupted with voices, all speaking that same ancient Korean dialect Doc had found in the scrolls. "Fight it, Knuckles," Axel shouted. "You're stronger than this." Declan's head snapped toward him, neck bending at an impossible angle. "Stronger? Yes, he is strong. His heart is full of violence. Do you know how many men he's killed? Not just in war, before, in alleys, in rings. His hands are stained with blood, just like all of you." "Doc," I whispered, "tell me you know how to handle this." Doc Blackburn was already pulling more items from his pack. A small bottle of holy water, some Buddhist prayer beads he'd gotten from a monk months ago, and a piece of paper covered in Korean characters. "It's a hybrid entity," he said quietly. "Part hungry ghost, part ancient spirit, part something else entirely. It feeds on violent deaths, on warfare, on the essence of soldiers. The more battles that were fought here, the stronger it got, and now we're the main course," Percy finished grimly. Declan began to levitate, his boots lifting inches off the floor. The shadows in the temple writhed and twisted, taking on shapes that hurt to look at. Through the windows, I could see those soldier shapes still moving through the snow, hundreds of them now, all converging on the temple. "The time of feeding is here," the voices said through Declan's mouth. "Your friend tried to resist. The one you called Zephyr. Would you like to hear his last thoughts? Would you like to feel what it was like when we pulled his soul apart?" That's when Doc began the exorcism. He started with the Lord's Prayer, then switched to Buddhist mantras, then to something much older, words from those ancient scrolls that made my ears bleed when I heard them. Percy joined in, holding up the prayer beads while Axel and I tried to hold Declan down. The possessed man's strength was inhuman. He threw us off like we were children, his body contorting in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The voices coming from his mouth changed rapidly: English, Korean, Chinese, Latin, and others far older. "Your ceremonies are meaningless," the entity roared through him. "We are not some minor spirit to be banished with prayers and trinkets. We are war itself. We are the hunger that drives men to kill their brothers. We are the darkness that lives in every soldier's heart." But Doc didn't stop. Sweat froze on his face as he continued chanting, mixing prayers and incantations from a dozen faiths. Blood began to trickle from his nose, but still he kept going. The air itself seemed to vibrate with power, both holy and profane. And then something unexpected happened. Another voice joined the chorus emanating from Declan, a familiar voice, thick with that Boston accent. "Sarge," Declan's own voice broke through, fighting against the others. "Sarge, I can feel them. They're in my head. All of them. All the soldiers, all the deaths. So much death." "Keep fighting, Knuckles," I shouted. "Don't let them win." His body began to thrash violently, skin rippling as if something was moving beneath it. The shadows in the room swirled faster, and the whispers grew to a deafening roar. Through the maelstrom, I heard Doc Blackburn's voice rise in one final prayer, a desperate mixture of Latin, Korean, and something far more ancient. Declan's back arched impossibly, and a sound emerged from his throat that will haunt me until the day I die. It was the sound of 1,000 battlefields distilled into a single scream, the death cry of every soldier who had ever fallen in combat. Then he collapsed. When Declan regained consciousness an hour later, he wasn't the same man. His eyes had returned to normal, but there was something broken in them now. He could barely speak above a whisper, and when he did, he would only repeat the same words over and over. "So many dead, so many dead." Doc Blackburn wasn't in much better shape. The exorcism had taken a terrible toll on him. Blood had dried beneath his nose and ears, and his hands shook so badly he could barely hold his canteen. But he kept studying those scrolls, searching desperately for anything that might help us survive. The entity hadn't gone quiet after possessing Declan. If anything, it had grown bolder. The walls of the temple now bled continuously, not red blood, but something black and ancient that moved against gravity and smelled like centuries-old battlefields. The whispers had become a constant chorus, and worse, we were starting to understand them. Percy huddled over his radio equipment, trying to make contact with anyone outside the valley. "It's like the whole world has gone dead," he said, adjusting dials with trembling fingers. "But I keep picking up transmissions from before Civil War communications, World War I field reports, Roman military orders. They're all real signals, but they're coming from the dead," Axel finished. The kid had aged years in the past few hours. The innocent farm boy was gone, replaced by someone who had seen too much, too fast. That's when we heard the rumbling from outside. At first, we thought it was artillery fire in the distance, but when we looked out the temple windows, we saw something much worse. The snow-covered ground was rippling like water, and from beneath it, things were emerging. Tanks from every era, half-formed and ghostly, their metal shells riddled with phantom battle damage. Artillery pieces that hadn't been fired in centuries. Weapons of war from throughout history, all moving on their own, all converging on our position. "It's growing stronger," Doc said, his voice barely audible. "The barrier between our world and whatever realm it inhabits, it's breaking down. Reality itself is starting to unravel in this valley." A ghostly M4 Sherman tank from World War II phased right through the temple wall, its crew of skeletal soldiers still at their posts. Through the haunted vehicle we could see the interior of the temple starting to change. The wooden floors began to rot and reform, showing glimpses of every battle that had ever been fought on this ground. One moment we were standing on ancient Korean soil soaked with blood, the next on the deck of a Roman warship, then in a World War I trench. How do we stop it? I demanded, grabbing Doc's shoulder. There has to be a way. He looked up at me with eyes that had seen too much. The scrolls mention only one thing, a ritual of binding that was attempted centuries ago. It required sacrifice, willing sacrifice, the pure soul of a warrior freely given. Before anyone could respond, Axel stepped forward. There was something different about him now, a calmness that hadn't been there before, like a soldier laying down his life to save his squad. No, I grabbed him by his jacket. Don't even think about it, kid, that's an order. He smiled sadly. You know what my father told me before I enlisted? He said, son, there are two kinds of courage. There's the courage to fight and kill for what you believe in, and there's the courage to die for those you love. I never understood what he meant until now. The temple walls were barely visible now, lost in a swirling maelstrom of battlefield scenes from throughout history. The ghostly soldiers were everywhere, their forms flickering between different eras, different wars, different deaths. The entity's laughter echoed from every direction, growing louder, more triumphant. Axel pulled away from my grip with surprising strength. He turned to Doc. Tell me what I need to do. Axel, please, Percy tried to reason with him. You're just a kid. Not anymore. He checked his weapon with steady hands. I haven't been a kid since I saw what was in that chamber, since I felt what lived in those shadows. He turned to Doc again. The ritual, now. Doc's hands were shaking as he held up one of the scrolls. It has to be done in the chamber, where the entity is strongest. The sacrifice has to be made willingly, with full knowledge and acceptance of what's to come. No, Declan spoke for the first time in hours, his voice raw. I should do it. I'm the one who's already touched that thing, already corrupted. Axel shook his head. That's why it has to be me. I'm the only one who's still whole, the only one who hasn't been tainted by that thing yet. And if we don't stop it here, now, it'll keep growing stronger, keep feeding, keep spreading. The walls of the temple had completely disappeared now, replaced by an endless vision of warfare throughout history. We could see every battle ever fought, every death ever died in the name of war, all happening simultaneously around us. The entity's presence was overwhelming, its darkness seeping into our very bones. Axel turned to me one last time. Sarge, tell my folks I wasn't afraid. Tell them I figured out what kind of courage I had. Before any of us could stop him, he grabbed the scroll from Doc's hands and sprinted toward the trap door leading to the chamber below. The stone slab flew off on its own, darkness billowing up from the opening like smoke. Cover me, he shouted, and jumped into the abyss. We ran to the edge, watching as he disappeared into the darkness below. The last thing we heard was his voice, strong and clear, beginning to recite the ancient words Doc had taught him. Then the screaming began. What followed was a sound I hope no human ever has to hear again. It wasn't just Axel screaming, it was the entity, the armies of the dead, the very fabric of reality itself, all howling in one terrible voice. The chamber below erupted with a light that wasn't light at all, but rather the absence of darkness, if such a thing can exist. We have to help him, Percy shouted, already moving toward the opening. No, Doc grabbed him. The ritual requires the sacrifice to be alone, if we interfere, but whatever he was about to say was cut off as Declan suddenly convulsed. They're fighting him, he gasped, his eyes rolling back. All of them, every soldier, every warrior, every death, but he's not afraid. Gods help me, the kid isn't afraid at all. The temple was coming apart around us. The walls weren't just bleeding anymore. They were dissolving, revealing glimpses of other times, other battles, other realities. I saw Gettysburg and Waterloo, Thermopylae and Normandy, all happening at once. Soldiers from every era fought and died in an eternal moment. Through it all, we could hear Axel's voice from below, still reciting the ancient words. His voice was growing weaker, but his determination never wavered. The entity's presence was everywhere now, its darkness trying to snuff out Axel's light, but somehow the kid kept going. The text said the sacrifice had to be pure. Doc shouted over the chaos. Not just willing, but pure. That's why it had to be him. He was the only one of us who still believed in something bigger than war, bigger than death. Percy's radio exploded in a shower of sparks, and through the ruined speaker we heard voices, thousands of them, all speaking at once. Among them, we heard Zephyr's voice again, but this time, it was different. "We're helping him." Our lost scout's voice came through clearly. "All of us who fell here, all of us who became part of it, we're giving him our strength." The entity's scream rose to a pitch that shattered what remained of the temple's windows. The darkness began to coalesce into a single point above the chamber entrance, forming into that same, massive, shifting shape we'd seen before. But now we could see it clearly, a writhing mass of soldiers from throughout history, all fused together in a perpetual moment of death. "You cannot bind us," it roared in its thousand voices. "We are eternal. We are war itself." But Axel's voice continued from below, growing stronger now, joined by a chorus of the dead. Not just Zephyr, but every soldier who had ever died in this cursed valley. They were all chanting with him, their voices harmonizing in dozens of languages across thousands of years. Declan suddenly stood straight, his eyes clear for the first time in hours. "I can feel it," he said in his own voice. "It's weakening. The hold it has on the dead, it's breaking." The entity thrashed in the air above us, its form beginning to unravel. The faces within it were changing, no longer screaming in agony but looking almost peaceful. One by one, the spirits of the dead were breaking free. "Look," Percy pointed through one of the dissolving walls. The ghostly armies outside were fading, the phantom tanks and artillery pieces disappearing like mist in the morning sun. The endless scenes of battle were receding, reality slowly knitting itself back together. But the entity wasn't going quietly. With a roar that shook the mountains themselves, it plunged down into the chamber where Axel was completing the ritual. There was a blinding flash, a sound like every gun ever fired going off at once, and then silence, complete and utter silence. When we could see again, the temple had returned to normal. The walls were solid, no longer bleeding or showing visions of other times. The supernatural cold was gone. Even the whispers had stopped. We rushed to the chamber entrance. The stone steps leading down were intact, no longer the rough hole we'd fallen through before. With shaking hands, I lifted my flashlight and shined it into the darkness below. The massive chamber was empty. No bodies, no armies of the dead, no ancient horror writhing in the shadows. Only smooth stone walls bearing a single line of text in that ancient script. Doc translated it quietly. "Here lies the guardian, who gave his soul to bind the dark." Of Axel Thorne, we found only his dog tags. The metal somehow aged to look centuries old. His body, like those of all the others who had vanished in this place, was gone. But he hadn't been taken by the entity like the others. He had chosen his fate, and in doing so, had saved not just us, but possibly the entire world from what that thing would have become. Declan knelt and picked up the dog tags. "Semper Fi, kid," he whispered, though Axel had been Army, not Marines. But in that moment, it didn't matter. A soldier is a soldier, and Axel had proved himself the bravest of us all. The journey out of the valley was almost anticlimactic after what we'd experienced. The supernatural blizzard had cleared, revealing a cold but ordinary winter morning. The village had changed too. The buildings were now ancient ruins, crumbling and clearly abandoned for centuries. No more hot food on tables, no more mysterious fires burning in hearths. Reality had reasserted itself. "We need to move," I ordered, though it pained me to leave without recovering Zephyr's body or giving Axel a proper burial. The Chinese are still out there, and we're down to 4 men. Doc Blackburn insisted on taking the scrolls. What was left of them? Most had crumbled to dust after the entity was bound, but a few survived. Percy salvaged what he could from his radio equipment, though nothing seemed to work anymore. And Declan just stared at the ruins of the temple, his eyes haunted by memories no man should have to carry. We'd barely made it halfway up the first ridge when we heard engines in the distance. For a moment, we feared the phantom tanks had returned, but the sound was beautifully, wonderfully normal. A rescue column from our own lines, sent to find us after we'd gone silent for 2 days. The commanding officer, a fresh-faced lieutenant named Harrison, couldn't hide his shock at our condition. "We thought you were dead," he said. "Hell, HQ already listed you as KIA. What happened out there?" I looked at my surviving men. Doc was clutching the ancient scrolls like a lifeline. Percy had gone completely gray at the temples. Declan's eyes still held shadows of what had possessed him. How could we possibly explain? We got lost in the storm, I said finally. Lost 2 good men. The rest is classified. The lieutenant clearly didn't believe me, but he was smart enough not to press. As we climbed into the rescue vehicles, I looked back one last time at the valley. For a moment, I thought I saw figures standing in the ruins. Zephyr and Axel, watching us leave, standing guard. Then the morning mist rolled in, and they were gone. The official report listed Zephyr Wolf Creek and Axel Thorne as missing in action, presumed killed in action. The brass didn't ask too many questions about what happened. Maybe they didn't want to know. Maybe they'd heard stories about that valley before. Or maybe, in a war as brutal as Korea, 2 more mysterious casualties weren't worth investigating. We tried to stay in touch after the war, the 4 survivors of that nightmare. Doc Blackburn threw himself into religious studies, eventually becoming both a priest and a scholar of ancient Korean texts. He spent decades trying to understand what we'd encountered, though he never published his findings. He died in his sleep in 1989, his personal journal filled with warnings about the thin places between worlds. Percy Hawthorne had the hardest time adjusting. The things he'd heard through his radio haunted him. He claimed he could still pick up transmissions from the dead through any electronic device. In 1975, he vanished from his home in Georgia. His family found his radio equipment running at full volume, playing nothing but static. They never found his body. Declan Knuckles Fitzgerald seemed to recover best, at least on the surface. He opened a boxing gym in South Boston, teaching kids how to channel their aggression into sport rather than violence. But every year, on the anniversary of that night, he would shut himself away and drink until he couldn't remember the voices that had spoken through him. He died in 1997, his last words being, "They're waiting for me, all of them." As for me, I've lived a long life, longer than I probably deserved. I got married, had children, tried to be normal, but I've never stopped feeling it, that presence we encountered in the valley. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers. Sometimes, I see faces in the shadows that shouldn't be there. And sometimes, I dream of Axel, standing eternal guard over that ancient evil, ensuring it remains bound. The doctors say the cancer will take me soon. Maybe that's why I'm finally telling this story, because someone needs to know. Someone needs to remember what happened in that valley and the sacrifice that was made there. A few months ago, I saw something in the news that chilled me to my bone. A team of South Korean archaeologists disappeared while excavating an ancient site near the DMZ. The official story blamed North Korean interference. But I know better. I've seen the satellite photos of the area. I recognize those ruins. The valley is still there, still waiting. And sometimes, I fear that what we encountered wasn't unique. How many other ancient battlefields hold similar horrors? How many other entities feed on humanity's endless appetite for war? To anyone reading this, particularly any soldiers, if you're ever in Korea and you find yourself near an isolated valley where the snow falls even when the sky is clear, where the shadows move wrong and the air tastes like old blood, turn back, leave that place to the dead. Leave it to the brave young man who stands guard there, the last sentinel against an evil older than war itself. Because not all heroes are remembered in history books. Some, like Axel Thorne, make their sacrifices in secret, fighting battles that can never be recorded. And some victories, like some horrors, are best left in the shadows where they belong.